Hello, theologians. Last week, we read an article from B.B. Warfield that challenged who we are as theological students. Hopefully, you're able to see that theology should have a radical influence on who we are. This week, we'll be thinking about what we bring to our theology. Your background and your personality will cause theology to take a certain shape. In order to see how individuals all bring something different to theology, I want us to think about the issue of thinking itself. To do so, I'm going to reflect on some ideas from sociologist Peter Berger. Berger pointed out that our culture is characterized by two extremes in thinking. On the one extreme is relativism, the position that says no one has any absolute knowledge of anything. On the other extreme is fundamentalism, which says that some people can have absolute certainty of some things. Here's a quote from Berger. Relativism is bad for civility because it precludes the moral condemnation of virtually anything at all. Fundamentalism is bad for civility because it produces irresolvable conflict with those who do not share its beliefs. Berger sets his context by describing pluralization, which is the situation in which different ethnic or religious groups coexist under conditions of civic peace and interact with each other socially. So as different groups of worshipers and thinkers send their kids to the same schools and vote in the same elections, they find ways to get along with each other. Berger says that religious freedom leads to a type of religious consumerism. For example, church shopping and church hopping would have been just inconceivable in medieval Europe. In today's America, however, you can choose between 20 different churches within driving distance, just like you choose between maybe 20 different types of toothpaste at Walmart. And Berger notes further that since there are a lot of religious and ideological choices, certainty becomes much harder to achieve. And since certainty is a hallmark of the Enlightenment, this causes a lot of trouble for a lot of different people. Since the uncertainty of relativism seemed to contradict the stance of religious confidence, a movement called fundamentalism arose to make religious certain again. Berger provides the following definition. Fundamentalism is the attempt to restore or create anew a taken-for-granted body of beliefs and values. In other words, fundamentalism is always reactive. And what it reacts against is precisely the aforementioned relativization process. It's important to note that there's a difference between fundamentalism with a capital F and fundamentalism with a lowercase f. In the first part of the 20th century, a group of conservative Christian writers produced a number of pamphlets called The Fundamentals. These were writings that talked about particular non-negotiable beliefs or fundamentals that someone had to believe in order to be a Christian. These included beliefs like the virgin birth and Jesus' literal resurrection. So what's the difference between fundamentalism with a capital F and fundamentalism with a lowercase f? Fundamentalism with a capital F is a historical movement linked to a theological context which reacted against Protestant liberalism based mostly in Germany. The lowercase fundamentalism relates to the attitude that comes with possessing a taken-for-granted body of beliefs and values. This attitude describes someone who knows that he's right and knows that anyone who disagrees with him must be wrong. There's a lot of forms of fundamentalism. Yes, there are fundamentalists like Jerry Falwell. He knew his religion was right. He knew his conservative Republican stance was right, and everybody else was just simply wrong. According to fundamentalists with a capital F, God's existence is taken for granted. A specific literal interpretation of the Bible is assumed. According to anyone with common sense, they should be able to see it the same way. But Berger also notes all sorts of secular worldviews and value systems can give rise to fundamentalist movements. Radical nationalism, political ideology, scientism, even secularism, as the belief that religion should be rigorously excluded from public life. As an example of a non-fundamentalist, check out what the new atheist Sam Harris says in his Atheist Manifesto. Atheism is nothing more than a commitment to the most basic standards of intellectual honesty. One's convictions should be proportional to one's evidence, pretending to be certain when one isn't, indeed, pretending to be certain about propositions for which no evidence is even conceivable, is both an intellectual and moral failing. Notice that Harris's position, in his estimation, is just plain common sense. Intellectual honesty is at work. Again, in his naturalistic worldview, things are just taken for granted the way that he sees them. According to Harris, religious people are dangerous because they're just so stinking certain about their crazy beliefs. And of course, Harris declares this with his own unwavering confidence in his own certainty. In fact, I might even argue that Sam Harris could be a more consistent fundamentalist than even Jerry Falwell. So here's the challenge we're faced with when we do theology. How do we avoid the excesses of relativism on the one hand and fundamentalism on the other? How do you find a proper balance of openness and also conviction? To get back to Berger's definition, consider this question. What are your taken for granted beliefs? How do you react when things that are just so obvious to you simply aren't obvious to other people? Are you frustrated when others can't see the world in the same way you do? It's interesting that Jesus' standard for inclusion was not necessarily being right, but being unified. Check out John 17. I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one, I in them and you in me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as you loved me. We need to understand that Jesus' hope for unity is not the same thing as uniformity. We are not all going to look the same, but we can have the same goals that unify us. A good example of unity without uniformity is the Fellowship of the Rings. You have men, hobbits, elves, dwarves, definitely very different creatures, yet they're unified in a very definite mission. In the same way, as believers, we need to find ways to gather around the same mission. In this week's reading, we have a good example of three theologians who have very different approaches to doing theology. And I want us to think about how these three different approaches came together to make up the early church. Clement is the philosopher. For him, theological questions provide a chance to think. It's important to get the question right and use logic and rationality. Tertullian is the moralist. For him, theological questions provide a chance to do the right thing. Since our actions reveal our real selves, theology needs to result in living good, ethical lives. Irenaeus is the priest. For him, theological questions provide a chance to do church. Since the church is the body of Christ, we can only be right people when we're properly related to other church members. This week, you'll learn from the earliest Christian theologians. How can we look at the same theological issue from very different positions? I look forward to seeing how you wrestle with understanding yourself and each other as we try to understand God better together. Have a great week.